This podcast is hosted by the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, USA, which is about a mile from the former grounds of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. We are working to bring honest interpretations of the Carlisle Indian School that was in operation from 1879 until 1918. We honor the 7,800 Indigenous students from across the United States who came to Carlisle. The Indian School is a significant place of remembrance for our Native peoples. Because of the endurance, strength, and prayers from our people who went to the Carlisle Indian School, many of us are here today. Guatsi relatives, it's yours truly, Dr. Kautui or Dr. Mandy. I'm so excited to be here with Dr. John Truden. How are you today, John?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
I'd like for you to share a little bit more about yourself. Who are you?
I'll start from the very, very beginning. My ancestors were Welsh and Slovenian immigrants who came to the United States in, I think, like the 16th century and then the 19th century, respectively. My name is Slovenian. It comes from my great-grandfather. I can't trace him back further than Cleveland, where he was a steel worker in the early 20th century. I come from those people. I grew up in suburbia, in suburban Detroit, and then suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, respectively. Got an undergrad degree from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington in history, and then I got an MA and PhD in history from the University of Oklahoma in 2018 and 2023, respectively. Shout out to my advisor, Ann Hyde, and my undergrad advisor, David Levere. They're good people. Let's see, I married my wife, Emily, while we were living in Oklahoma. And we also got our dog, Ruffles, like the Chips. He thinks he's a horse, and I don't know, he's a strange dog, but we love him. I'm currently the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Native American and Indigenous Studies at the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples, where I do research related to Indigenous communities. I'm working on a couple of book projects. One is at press, or is it kind of under revision, and the other one I've been working on gradually. But that's where I'm at.
Thanks for sharing some of your journey. So you've been kind of all over the place in the United States.
Absolutely.
So Carlisle, I'm really curious to know, why did you come to Carlisle? Why are you here? Why are you a part of this research and this healing journey that we're on?
So it's kind of funny because I knew about Carlisle before I knew about Dickinson College. You know, I was using the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center that was put together by Jim and other people in some of my research related to Indigenous peoples in Oklahoma. And when I saw this job, I applied for it because, that's what you do as an academic when you get a degree, and, you apply for jobs and try to get them. And this was the job that I got out of 50 something applications that I did. So it's kind of funny. I wouldn't have thought of coming to Pennsylvania, especially as somebody where it's really important to me to work with Native communities. And this job involves a lot of working with Native communities, which I'm happy about. But, I wouldn't have thought that would have been in Pennsylvania, since there is a substantial Indigenous community in Philly and some people in Pittsburgh as well. But it's, PA is not known for having tons and tons of Native people. Where I came from, Oklahoma had 39 tribes, and Arizona's got a number of them. I mean, California, there's just a lot more Native people in the West. So I would have thought I would have ended up here, or ended up there. But I came out here because Darren Lonefight offered me the job. It's funny, at the time he offered it to me, I was doing research for the Chickasaw Nation in the National Archives. I was researching a historical problem for them, and Darren Lonefight gave me the call, and he was like, "Hey, I want to talk to you about the position." And I was like, "Oh man, I'm probably not going to get this position," because that's kind of how the market works. It's just it can get very depressing very quickly. And he was like, "Hey, you are a top job candidate. I want you to, I want to offer you the job." And I was like, "Oh, you're okay, cool." So my wife and I were in DC, which is funny because we lived in Oklahoma at the time. So we physically drove up and to Carlisle the next day. So it was the one time of that year that we would have had the opportunity to do that. And we kind of went up here and we were like, this would be weird to live up here, but it'd be a good thing. And, it was kind of the only job I had at the time. I came here because I think the center, at least, I don't know, I came here out of necessity because that's what you do when you get a job, an academic job. It's a tough market. But I also came here because I believe in the mission of the center. And I still believe in that mission of assisting Indigenous communities to try to get their kids back, to assist Indigenous communities impacted by boarding schools, to kind of address Dickinson's ancestral ties and present ties as well to Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I mean, those things are super important. And I'm really proud to have been part of that in the last 18 months or so. So that's really cool.
So, as a non Indigenous person, and as you're here in Carlisle navigating this place, of course, as we know, is a significant place of remembrance for our Indigenous relatives, how do you process Carlisle, especially because you're actually in the classroom teaching about our Indigenous histories and peoples and communities? So, how do you process this place?
So I want to start by saying, and kind of focusing on the first part, as a non-native person, understandably, I guess, I've really grappled with being non-native and doing native history. And at first I came at it like without really understanding what Indigenous ways of knowing were, and just sort of being like, oh, I should be able to just do history because, and that was the kind of program that I was kind of brought up in. And the more I interacted with Indigenous people, I was like, okay, my skill set actually has a lot of value here. I could be doing things, right? And I also, you kind of run into some discussions about, okay, should you be doing certain types of history? And I've gradually kind of made some rules for myself to I don't talk about sacred things. I don't do histories of peoples. I try to limit myself to specific kinds of topics that are more appropriate. So I've kind of had to grapple with being a non-native person, doing native history. And I've also come to the conclusion that it's important that non-native people talk about native history and process native history. Native people cannot be the only people doing that. That's not fair to them. It's not right, because all Americans should understand Indigenous history. Now, I'm getting kind of off the point. Carlisle is an interesting space. I think Dickinson is sort of a symptom of a larger thing where it's almost like, you ever see that movie, for the Stephen King movie, It?
Yes, when I was a little girl. Probably shouldn't have been watching it then.
Man, that would be scary to
I
as a little
know.
kid. Especially oh boy, yeah.
Uh-huh.
The kid with the brain and
I just remember the balloon and the boat.
oh my goodness. Ugh. Well, it's sort of what kind of like that, where I think, and I would guess it has something to do with the boarding school, but there's all these disconnected constituencies of people, right? There's like the truckers, there's the Dickinson College students and faculty, there's the War College, there's the tourists that go to the car show. There's kind of the middle-class white people and the wealthy middle-class white people. Carlisle's kind of racially segregated, so there's one part of town that's predominantly people of color. There's Section 8 housing. There's a bunch of different parts of the town that are all kind of segregated from each other. And I almost think it's kind of like that movie, It, because it's almost like there's something underneath all of that. The town gets tax money from all these different constituencies, right? They get money from Section 8 housing. They get money from Dickinson College students being here. They get money from all this stuff. But the town as a whole doesn't really identify those things as its own, right? Like, I've never seen Dickinson be kind of part of the identity of Carlisle, or the War College, or the law school that's here, or the truckers, right? Like, it's something about, I don't know why that's the way it is, but it's something about the way the community is structured. And it's got to be old, where there's all these different things that exist here, and they sort of feed, like the town as a whole kind of uses all of them, but then doesn't acknowledge them as part of it. So to be honest with you, that kind of creeps me out. But and I like Carlisle. Like, there's a lot of nice people here, but there's something. It's like almost like there's something in the water or something underneath it. I don't know. That may be kind of mean to Carlisle, but I don't know. That's been my experience being here. Is that I really like Dickinson College a lot, but the structure of this town is, I don't know. It's like people don't talk to each other. It's like you got a bunch of little silos. And I think some of that has to do with the boarding school, but also just some of it has to do with the way this community was created and also restructured through white flight in the 20th century. But I experienced Carlisle in a very different way as a white middle class person than, say, like you, Mandy. I don't get people coming up to me and asking me about my identity very much. I can kind of freely move through a space, and that is definitely a consequence of racism and kind of institutional racism. And it's sort of like something I have to keep in mind, especially when working with like the delegations that come here and trying trying to think about their perspectives and the way they're encountering it, because that's very different from the way that I would encounter a place. And a lot of that is almost unconscious in some ways, because it's, you just kind of, you go through life and things happen, but you don't necessarily like analyze it all the time. I don't do boarding school scholarship. It's like, I've become more familiar with it while I'm here. I think I'm glad that the National Park Service is going to have a national monument here in the future. There needs to be something that says that there needs to be something that says that happened. And right now we don't have anything that says it happens. Yeah, that's how I come at it. I think with the knowledge that I don't totally, as a non-native person, as a white person, I don't have the same experiences. And so I try to empathize with other people because that's what I have.
I was going to share that there's a lot of different elements that come up as you're sharing story here and from your perspective. And I think about the blood that has been shed on this land. And I think it's really interesting, the perspective about that. There's something underground, right? There's this undertone here. And I full-heartedly agree with that, because even within this 60-mile radius of Carlisle, right? I think about this a lot too, is the association and the connection to the Civil War and how so many people lost their lives within a span of a few days. And so I do think that there's something deeply spiritually rooted here, and that this place is very different. So I really appreciate your perspective and sharing story in that way. And as we're here in this space, what comes up for me is that we were actually, and I share this story pretty often, and I shared in another podcast episode, is that how we're treated differently, right, in different spaces. And in particular, we were at this restaurant celebrating your birthday in early December. And I want to kind of talk through this because I'm curious to hear your perception of this. And so essentially we were at a table. There was John, our other friend Holly, and two other of our relatives there. One was one of our board members and a student who's native Hawaiian. And so we were at this place, and this one person walks up to us, probably middle-aged white guy, maybe in his 60s actually, and started talking to us about probably for a good 10 minutes. And he actually came and looked at me first and was like, pointed at me. He's like, "Were you at the barracks yesterday?" And I was like, "Yep, I was there." And he's like, "Oh, I recognize you from your hat." And so I wear this Thunder Voice hat company, this tan wide brimmed hat. And I was like, "Yeah, I was there." And so then he went on for like 10 minutes talking about like the history that he's known about our native people. And so there comes a point, right, where you're like, okay, like, we're trying to just sit here and enjoy each other's
Trying to
company.
have breakfast.
Yeah, right. And so that happened. And then probably like just a few minutes after, there was this white woman who came up. She's maybe in her 70s, 80s. And she looked at me and she was like, "Are you Indian?" And I responded to her, "Do you think I am?" And she's like, "Well, by your feathers and by your hat, yes." And so this is kind of how this all transpired. And then a few minutes after, when we left the restaurant, this other woman came up to me and was like, "Hey, I like your hat." And I was like, "Thanks." So within a span of like 30-ish minutes, 40 minutes, like there's these people that approached us. So I'm curious to know, has this ever happened to you? What did you think about that experience? Because you were there with me in this space.
No, that doesn't happen to me. Yeah, I'm a middle-class white guy in America. People don't come up to me and ask me about my identity. So it's always kind of, even that experience was, I believe you've told me about that before, but it was jarring to even see that happen, right? And I think that's part of what I was talking about with like, I don't have those experiences, but that doesn't mean I can't have empathy and kind of like try to be a supporter or an ally. I also think it's interesting thinking about kind of how like whiteness functions in America, which is sort of a perennial interest for me, or not perennial, a continuing interest for me. And that I wonder if my family 100 years ago would have been treated the same way that I'm treated now. But I think that, yeah, I don't know. That was a weird experience, but also it seems like it's a lot to process, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
Yeah, then we could go on for a while talking about these dynamics, right? Of even just the differences within, who we are and our identities and how we occupy space in Carlisle.
yeah.
And so to bring it back here to Dickinson College, like you've taught a number of classes over the last couple of years you've been here. And I just was curious to know if you can elaborate a little bit more about your approach to teaching these Indigenous focused topics, and how do you go about navigating happening in the classroom and teaching Indigenous-focused content to primarily non-Indigenous learners?
Sure. So I think the main thing, and I should say too, Dickinson is what's called a PWI, or a predominantly white institution. That's a term that came out of Africana studies, and I think it's handy. We are basically almost entirely non-native. I mean, there's a few Kanaka Maoli students and faculty. There are, as far as I understand, no federally recognized tribal citizens, with the exception of Mandy. You're from an Indigenous community that's federally recognized, correct?
Heck yes.
And then we have a few kids who are unrecognized, who I would bet, it's important to support them. But it is a very non-native place. And given Carlisle's history, it's even more important to emphasize the Indigenous intersections with this place than I think normally it would be. And normally it would already be important. But because, Indigenous communities are tied to every part of the U.S. They, all of the U.S. is on Indian land. So, if you're going to talk about U.S. history, you have to talk about Indigenous people. And I was trained as a historian. Here, I teach kind of a mix of Native studies and history. And pretty much throughout all my classes, what I have kind of focused on is amplifying Native perspectives on history and Native studies. And this kind of comes easier in Native studies than it does in history. But in history, what you got to do is just you go get primary sources of Native people talking. Because I can't speak for Indigenous people. What I can do is give my students, who are predominantly non-Native people to talk to, and primary sources that are from Native people. I think one of the things it's a commonality with Carlisle and much of the United States is that most of the time my non-Native students most of them have never met any Indigenous people and don't realize, a lot of the time they don't realize they still exist. B, they have not received education that emphasizes Native points of view or really focuses on Native people in any depth. Sometimes you get kids who have really they've studied Pope's revolt, or they have looked at just different, the Battle of Little Bighorn, or, but it's rare. And even that's kind of even talking about just military conflicts is kind of a cursory way to understand the indigenous experiences in North America. It's not really, you're not understanding a full depth of who Indigenous communities are. But, so we're almost always starting from kind of a baseline. Like this course I have this semester, Federal Indian Law and Policy, right? Nobody has a background in this. And in some ways that makes it easier because you can just start from jump and, be like, this is this and this is that. It makes it a lot easier to do. But you also have a lot of assumptions to deal with about Indigenous people. And to their credit, a lot of Dickinson students are pretty, they want to do the right thing. They want to try to, when they see something wrong, they want to fix it, or they want to work together with others to fix it. And so they're good listeners. They really care about this stuff, and they care about learning about Indigenous communities. So I think that gives me a lot of hope. But I think the main thing to start is just emphasizing Indigenous perspectives and using the skill set that I have, which is mostly a research skill set. It's a skill set of, I'm good at finding things. I'm good at gathering things, and which sounds like a really simple skill, and it is in some ways, and it's not in others, right? But going and getting things and then putting together and synthesizing them in a way that people can understand them, right? Because everybody can't just go into the archive, right, into the National Archives branch and go get stuff and then say, okay, we're just going to give you a mountain of documents. You have to pick and choose and kind of interpret things in a way that makes sense. So that's a lot of what I do, is kind of, especially with thinking about our mostly non-Native students who are from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, right? Mostly from the Mid-Atlantic. What kind of gathering from trying to help them understand Indigenous communities and their experiences, I think the best thing I can do for them is just give them kind of what Native people are already saying and thinking about, rather than trying to, and some of that involves really having to curate and do extra work to kind of find those voices. But I think that's important. You can't just give them a textbook. You have to go find things and get people to talk to too. I mean, like, I'm excited. We're going to have a tribal judge in my upcoming course. We're going to have the guy who directed the Seminole Nation's Office of Corporate and Business. I think it's Business and Corporate Regulatory Authority, right? We're going to have people who are real people who are ran Indigenous institutions or are involved in Indigenous law who can speak to those things. I'm going to have some of the members of the Native American Law Student Association, Dickinson Law. I'm excited about that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating more on that. And as part of our journey here to educate and to share more about our Indigenous peoples, there's actually the CFNP has a library that you have played an integral role to help curate the lot of different content and the books that are there. Can you share more about the CFNP library and how it came into existence and give us an idea of what literature and pieces of work are in there?
Sure. Yeah, I love libraries. My mom, when I was kind of an adolescent, we lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, which has it's grown somewhat now. It was probably about 1.5 million, and it had a countywide library system that had 24 branches. And so my mom made it a goal of taking us to every library branch because she loved libraries, and she passed that on to me. So when we started the CFNP Lending Library, which is this project to kind of make a library that's accessible to it's a Native American and Indigenous Studies focused lending library that's not only available to students, but we also wanted it to be available to faculty, especially to the community at large, and to visiting Indigenous delegations that are coming to Carlisle for repatriation. And it started out with like 30 or 40 books that Darren Lonefight and a few donors bought. And then a few people like Susan Rose and Barbara Landis donated some books. And it's grown over time through grant money. I was able to administer a few grants from the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples and also for the Center for Civic Learning and Activism. I might be Civic Learning and Action, but we love those guys. But and also from like donations, we've gotten a ton of books from Susan Rose and Barbara Landis in particular. Actually, it's kind of funny. Every book that like Barbara Landis got that she donated, like a good, I'd say 75% of them is signed by the author. So we have these books from pretty famous like authors, like Susan Power, for example. I'm pretty sure her stuff is signed. And they're just like casually like, I love you, Barbara Landis, like because Barbara Landis is who's a kind of a community activist and worked for the Cumberland County Historical Society for a long time, knows a lot of people. And I'm really thankful that she donated a lot of her books. I love our library. We have about 650 books now, and we have a lot of different things. We have history and Indigenous ways of knowing and law and novels, and like we have an International Indigenous Peoples collection. We have a children's literature. We have a really nice boarding and residential school reference collection that's designed particularly around the fact that Dickinson has ties to Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And we really wanted that to be available to boarding school delegations, as well as the surrounding community. That is probably the crown jewel of our library. We have around 160 books, and it's a very complete collection. Like, obviously, there's new books being published on boarding and residential schools every year. But, I'm excited about that particular collection. That'll be useful for the future. And I'm excited for the library as a whole. Again, I want to emphasize it is available to anyone who would like to use it. There's no paywall. There's no barrier to entry. If you would like to check out a book, we just ask that you bring it back. And we do have a checkout system. But, anybody, even if you're not at Dickinson, can take a book and read it. And that was part of what we wanted to do, was to make all of that accessible. And we're still working on that accessibility. But that's really important to emphasize, that anyone can check out books from that lending library. It's a community resource as well as a reference library. That's really important.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing more information on that. I figured at this point we could share. You're very knowledgeable about Indigenous literature, and I thought it'd be great to give a list of recommendations based on different subjects. And I will put this in the show notes so that everybody has reference and access to the books that we're sharing here. But if you want, pull out a pen and paper and start taking notes and write down some of these book recommendations. So let's start here with, what are your 5 recommendations for Indigenous history, and in particular to the continental United States?
Yeah, I should say my area of expertise is in the continental U.S. I'm also going to say, like, doing 5 books is really hard. So it is not easy to choose 5 people or 5 authors because there are so many great works of Native history out there. And there are so many great, all of these categories are really, really difficult to choose 5 things. Too many good books out there. So I chose stuff that was specific to me. And also, but I also want to say, like, this is not an exclusive list, obviously. The first book I chose was John Stanton Timber's 1967 book, Cheyenne Memories. John Stanton Timber was a Cheyenne elder who worked with an anthropologist named Margot Liberty. And it's this incredibly vivid Cheyenne oral history. I spent a lot of time on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation with my friends Jim and Sherry Bement. They actually hosted me for a summer while I attended Chief Dull Knife College in Lame Deer, Montana, where I took a Cheyenne language class. So I've spent some time in that community, in the Northern Cheyenne community, and Cheyenne Memories is a treasure. More generally, I wanted to emphasize Adrian Keene's Notable Native People, 50 Indigenous Leaders, Dreamers, and Changemakers from Past and Present. This is a relatively recent book that's beautifully illustrated and emphasizes a lot of Native people who are alive in the present day, which is something that, even though I know history is often, we talk about the past. When we talk about Native people, we're always talking about like Tecumseh, and there's nothing wrong with talking about Tecumseh. But I mean, Tecumseh died in 1813, I think, 1812, right? Like, we also need to be talking about Native people who are alive at present and who are doing things today. And I think this book is really important for that reason, because it emphasized Native people who are alive and still, and a lot of young people. If you want a kind of more comprehensive history, Ned Blackhawk wrote a great book called The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. That came out in 2023. Ned Blackhawk wrote a great book before that about Indigenous peoples in the Great Basin. He's awesome. Nick Estes wrote a book that's called Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, which really looks at like the way that Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota people, or the Achedisackawin, or the Council of Seven Fires, have continuously upheld their sovereignty and kind of worked, connects the Standing Rock struggle that happened in the late 2010s to a much longer history. It's in the title, A Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance. I think that book is really interesting. It's really influential in Native studies and history. A new book that is by a non-Native author that I think is worth noting is by this guy named Claudio Sant, it's called Unworthy Republic, The Disposition of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory. And it really talks about what might have termed at one point Indian removal, but I think is more accurately, what he argues is more accurately termed deportation. Sant is arguing basically that we need to talk about deportation and that period, the Indian removal period under Andrew Jackson, in a different way, and think about it as like almost in the way we think about states ethnically cleansing areas. I think his book will be an important reference point in the future for talking about that period. And it's a period that, and kind of, especially for people on the East Coast, it's important to think about deportation or Indian removal because it affected so much of the United States in the 19th century. Like if you're from Ohio or Indiana or Michigan or Kentucky or Tennessee or North Carolina or Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, all of those places do not have as many Native people as they would have. In some cases, they have very few because they were removed. This huge swath of the country. So those are the 5 I would pick.
All right.
The 5 I would pick.
Yeah, thanks for going into that. So, okay, the next set here, what are your 5 recommendations for Indigenous-focused children's literature?
So this, again, is a pretty tough one because there is a lot of great in Native children's literature, particularly in the last 10 years. A lot of stuff has come out. So a lot of my stuff is recent. I really like Carol Lindstrom, whatever she puts out, but she put out We Are Water Protectors, which I believe won a Caldecott Award. That's about the Standing Rock struggle. I like Ashley Fairbanks' recent book that came out this year called This Land, which looks at different landscapes and is a really fun. I love the illustrations in it. I like Dawn Quigley's writings, particularly Jojo McCoon's, which is this chapter book series about an Ojibwe girl. I like Angeline Booley's The Firekeeper's Daughter and Warrior Girl on Earth, which are these 2 great YA novels. There's a lot of really good Indigenous YA literature that's coming out too. So I'm trying to emphasize not only just like picture books, but like different kinds of children's literature because that's a broad category. And then there's this really great YA novel. It's a graphic novel called Soldiers Unknown by this guy named Chag Lowry. I believe he's Yurok, and he talks about the experiences of Yurok soldiers in World War I in this really interesting way. That was published by the Pechanga Band of Indians in Southern California. The Yurok live in Northern California, but they have a press called Great Oak Press that a really fun time actually, with a grant from the CFNP, buying one of all of their stuff at the Western History Association's meeting I attended a while ago, which was a really great experience to like, okay, well, you guys are, they have all this cool stuff. So I got to go purchase one of everything basically, which the person selling was very excited about. But it was really cool to buy a bunch of stuff from a tribal press. But anyway, that's how I came into possession of that book. And we have a couple copies in our library. It's really, I love that book. It's so beautifully illustrated, and just, I don't know, it dwells on Indigenous identity and also on this historic moment where these people are basically like go to war, and they kind of are trying to figure out how navigate this much larger, like, difficult thing, but also maintain their identity, and like they come back, and I don't know, it's just very contemplative and thoughtful. I like it.
All right. Thanks for that list. Okay, let's move on to Indigenous fiction. What are your 5 recommendations?
Okay, so I want to say I interpreted this somewhat liberally. I think this was the hardest of the categories for me to nail something down, because there's so much good fiction, but also because there's like a bunch of different things that Native people have written. I normally don't do not Native fiction, so I'm more a nonfiction guy. And it should say something that I had so much trouble nailing it down because there's like so much good stuff. I kind of started with a 3-way tie. These 3 classic Indigenous novels one is by N. Scott Momaday, Housemaid of Dawn from 1969. Another is James Welch's Winter in the Blood from 1974. And Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony from 1977. All those by themselves are profound, and just like, I remember reading each one and being like, wow, this is a lot. I don't know. It's hard to describe any of them in terms of, I mean, their journeys of identity and thinking about like existence, and, they're all just massive, super influential novels. So, I mean, any of those are a great start to thinking about Native literature, and I can't say anything bad about any of them, but I think they're kind of peers of each other. Another thing I wanted to emphasize, and I might change my answer a little bit. Originally, I said Louise Erdrich was her own kind of person, right? Because she has written like 20 novels over the course of her career since she started working in the 1980s. I think she started with Love Medicine and The Beat Queen, and then she's still writing and owns her own bookshop in Minneapolis called Birch Bark Books. She's written mostly for adult audiences, but has written some children's literature as well. But I think I'm going to add Joy Harjo to that too. Joy Harjo and Louise Erdrich are 2 long-standing, I would say they're generational peers. Louise Erdrich is from the Turtle Man, or is a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe people, and then Joy Harjo is Muskogee Creek. And both of them have been active since the 1980s. Joy Harjo is a poet. Louise Erdrich is more of a novel writer. But I mean, Joy Harjo a couple of years ago was the poet laureate of the United States. And Louise Erdrich has just, I don't know, she's one of the most prolific Indigenous writers working today. So I think of them as sort of peers. Another thing I wanted to emphasize is that sometimes we forget about older Native writers, people like Jane Johnston Schoolcraft or William Apess. Jane Johnston Schoolcraft was an Ojibwe writer living in what is now Michigan in the 19th century. And I've heard a lot of people, she married Henry Schoolcraft, who was a much more famous American writer who recent scholarship kind of indicates he probably stole a bunch of stuff from her. But her writings are in this great kind of edited volume called The Sound the Stars Make Rushing Through the Sky, the writings of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, edited by this guy named Robert Dale Parker. She's sort of like, what I've often thought of her as is sort of like an Ojibwe version of Emily Dickinson, just a very eloquent poet who was writing in the early 19th century. I'd also say William Apess, who is this Pequot intellectual writing in about the same time. His writings are kind of collected in different places. He wrote this kind of collection called A Son of the Forest. And he's kind of, again, kind of a generational peer of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. Both of them are writing around the same time. And both of them are really interesting Indigenous people. One poet I wanted to point out was this guy named Gerald Visner. Gerald Visner is best known for his philosophical stuff. He's written a lot about Indigenous survivance and kind of just thinking about Indigenous people kind of philosophy. But he also wrote this epic poem kind of in the style of like Beowulf called Bear Island, The War at Sugar Point. And he published that in 2006. And that's about the last battle of the quote unquote Indian Wars, right? We often think of Wounded Knee. It's not a battle, it's a massacre. But actually, the last battle of, again, quote unquote, the Indian Wars, or this series of violent conflicts between Native people and the United States trying to take over their lands, was Native victory in 1898 when this band of Ojibwe people fought against the United States and repulsed U.S. soldiers at this place called Bear Island in Minnesota. And they won. And it's not well known, but it's pretty well documented that Ojibwe people trounced the United States and defeated them. So the Visitor in the 2000s wrote this epic poem about that. He's just an interesting guy, also very prolific. The last person I wanted to put on here is probably the most prominent Native author working at the moment, or at least the kind of most... It's hard to know who's going to be big in 20 or 30 years, but I'd say right now this person is like just very, very big. It's Tommy Orange, who is working at the Institute of American Indian Arts and came out with 2 novels so far. They're There in 2018 and then Wandering Stars in 2024. And both of those have been a big deal in the world of Indigenous literature. These are multi-perspective narratives that look from the perspective first from Indigenous people in Oakland, California in the present, and then kind of a multi-generational narrative that looks at Indigenous people connected to Carlisle Indian Industrial School over the course of many years. Those are some really interesting novels.
All right. So for this next list here, what about boarding school related books?
Okay, so boarding school books are like, I would read Brenda Child, Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940. I'd read, if you want to know about Kamloops, Celia Haig Brown published a book called The Kamloops Indian Residential School, Resistance and a Reckoning in 1987, and that was updated after the discovery of that mass grave in 2021. So there's a more recent version. David Moranis's biography of Jim Thorpe, Path Lit by Lightning, The Life of Jim Thorpe, I think is far and away just a better biography than and grapples with a lot of what happened to him. There's a really cool free graphic novel called Chilocco Indian School, A Generational Story, which is the result of multi-generational oral history interviews and research by Julie Pearson Little Thunder. And then Abigail Chabotnoy wrote a really great edited volume of poems about her ancestor and experiences who attended Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And that's called How to Dress a Fish. And that came out in 2019.
Great. Yeah, there's so many boarding school related books and content. And I encourage you, if you're on campus or if you're near, come by specifically and learn about these stories, because again, we're here in this place in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Literally, where we're recording this podcast, the former Indian school is about a mile from where we're at right now. So the next topic, your 5 recommendations for law and policy.
Okay. So I first wanted to say Vine Deloria Jr.'s Custer Died for Your Sins, an Indian Manifesto. That came out in 1969. It's a foundational book in a lot of like Native studies generally. And I should say Deloria's like practiced law, but also he's a lot of different things. I just think that's a really important book. A great book to introduce you to federal Indian law is Walter Echo Hawk's In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 Worst Indian Law Cases Ever Decided, that came out in 2010. Kind of a primer in federal Indian law is Thomas J. Biolsi's Deadliest Enemies, Law and Race Relations on and Off Rosebud Reservation. It came out in 2007. If you want to understand the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis, I think Sarah Deer's The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America is just essential. She's a Muskogee scholar who wrote this book arguing that the reason that we have this crisis in the first place is because of the way that federal law is structured and doesn't protect Native people and takes power away from tribal governments. Another contemporary issue to focus on is disenrollment. And that would be a great book for that is David E. Wilkins's Dismembered, Native Disenrollment and the Battle for Human Rights. That came out in 2017.
Okay. Yeah. So are you integrating some of these books into your class?
Yeah, I try to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, what are we doing? Robert Miller's Native America Discovered and Conquered, Biolsi's Deadliest Enemies, and then Sarah Deer's The Beginning and End of Rape are going to be the basis for the federal Indian law class.
All right. And so for our last category here, what are your recommendations for international Indigenous books?
This is hard too, because it's like there's so much stuff. So I picked some different things. Now, the first book I picked was How Nani K. Trasts From a Native Daughter, Colonialism and Sovereignty in Hawaii from 1999. This is this really important Kanaka Maoli intellectual. And I want to say I am not an expert on Kanaka Maoli issues or sovereignty, but people might say, well, why are you putting them in an international category? And I would say because their history is in some ways substantially different from Native peoples in the United States, in that the U.S. did a hostile takeover of the Kingdom of Hawaii, which was a monarchy, and, didn't sign a treaty, just took over everything. And there's plenty of documentary record that Kanaka Maoli people resisted that and continued to resist it, but they have not been treated the same way. They have a different legal relationship with the United States, for better or for worse. So I think the Kanaka Maoli experiences are almost in some ways different than, say, talking about Native peoples in the continental U.S. I wanted to point out Ailton Krenake's Life is Not Useful. This is a really interesting Brazilian intellectual. He hasn't published his thoughts very much, but he's been around since the 1980s, working on behalf of communities like his own, the Krenake people. This is part of a trio of works that he's published recently, where he talks about philosophy and indigenous identity in the Brazilian context. Really interesting guy. Another book I wanted to point out was Ursula Pike's An Indian Among Los Indigenous, a Native Travel Memoir. It was published in 2021. And it's really about her travels in the 1990s, working with Bolivian indigenous peoples. And the interesting thing about this is that Ursula Pike was from the Yurok people in Northern California. So what she's talking about is being an indigenous person in an American context and then going down to Bolivia and kind of realizing, okay, my context is actually really, really different from these indigenous communities in Bolivia. And that is such an interesting memoir. Yeah, I think she also talks a lot about volunteer tourism and the way that can be kind of exploitative. It's a really interesting kind of perspective. One of the most important contemporary issues I think that people should be aware of is the ongoing genocide against Uyghur people in Western China. A really great introduction to that is Darren Byler's In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony, 2021. He published it in 2021. And another really helpful contemporary resource on Gaza and on Palestinian history is Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Years' War on Palestine, a history of settler colonialism and resistance, 1917 to 2017. I should say these are not limited. There's so many books and so many resources to learn about international indigenous histories because there's so many different peoples. So I just picked 5 that I thought were particularly pressing and particularly interesting, but you could choose a million different other examples. And so I don't want to slight anybody by not choosing them.
Yeah, thanks for that list, John. All those books, you're very knowledgeable about these different topics, and I'm glad that we're able to share these recommended books, at least to start with for now. And again, as you mentioned, there's tons of literature in regards to all these categories and beyond. And so we thought it'd be a great time just to share some of these recommendations and a lot of these books that we have in our library too. So that's a great resource for our community members.
Yeah,
So
come use our library.
yeah, for sure. So as we close today, is there anything else you'd like to share as we close up this story time?
I think I'm okay. Thank you for interviewing me today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And we just honor you as you've been with our center for about 1.5 years. And I know that in these next few months, you'll be, making your journey beyond and looking for other jobs and opportunities. And so we're rooting for you, cheering for you. And so we thank you for the time and service you have dedicated to the center here in Carlisle. And we hope that you, just have learned so much in being in this space and time. And we just honor you, John.
Thanks, Mandy. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We look forward to catching you on the next podcast episode for the Indigenous Revolt, Carlisle, PA, and beyond.
Yay.
Much love to our Dickinson College Student Advisory Board Fellow, Abigail Gotchel, who is Tyendinaga Mohawk, for helping to edit this episode. She's a senior graduating in May with a degree in biochemistry and molecular biology. You're amazing, Abby, and we love you so much. Special thanks to Dr. John Truden for joining me today and sharing his perspective. Again, a list of his book recommendations will be in the show notes. If you want to learn more about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, visit the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center at carlisleindian.dickinson.edu. Many thanks to Brenda Landis for teaching me the technical process of producing a podcast. Learn more about the Center for the Futures of Native Peoples at dickinson.edu/CFNP. Follow us on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X at CFNP Dickinson. Authenticity is important. You can also learn more about me at amandachermiah.com, and you spell my last name CHEROMIAH. You can also connect with me at drchermiah on TikTok, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. You can also email me at CHEROMIA@dickinson.edu. I honor my relatives who came to the Carlisle Indian School. Because of them, I am here. And in the words of Chief Philip Whiteman Jr., who's Northern Cheyenne and is a descendant from the Carlisle Indian School, he says, "I love you and there is nothing you can do about it." Hashtrame Gume, Dwaya, thank you so much. Amushrama. Really appreciate you listening to our podcast. And until next time, relatives, I'll talk to you later.